Summer 2020, July 4th weekend, I'm doing this documentary, and it's about the Trump peace plan where Netanyahu's getting ready to annex the entire West Bank. You're like, whoa, you know, as if 2020 hasn't had enough, right? BLM, COVID, you name it. And a presidential election year, well, boom, you know, Jared Kushner, Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu. These names are just going to be hammered all over the news once Israel goes forth and annexes the West Bank and the Jordan River Valley. So this documentary, which I'm just doing a video introduction, the rest is going to be just me narrating. I'm going to use GarageBand and dump the audio in iMovie, and then just show these images. I've never done it that way. I'm kind of doing it backwards, what I normally do. But anyhow, I'm going to explain to you how we got to this point. How is it that we're at 2020, you know, and Israel's about ready to annex the West Bank? So I want to go through the history of everything that I think is important that leads to this point. So having said that, actually, that's without further ado, I suppose, is more appropriate. Let's just get right into it, okay? Because it's long enough as it is. Hope you enjoy it. Well, I'm going to assume everybody knows that there's always been a Jewish presence in the nation of Israel. There's always been a remnant. It's, you know, for 2,000 years, there's been this diaspora of Jews spread out all over the world through their various evictions from the land of Israel by foreign occupiers. What I'm going to start off with is the map of the land that was promised to the chosen people, the promised land in the Bible. We're going to go back to the book of Genesis, and you can see from this map that is showing you from the Euphrates River to the Nile River, all the way up through the Fertile Crescent and down into the Levant. This next rudimentary boundary you're looking at is not from the book of Genesis, but from the book of Exodus. So it's kind of a reiteration of the boundaries, the original boundaries of Israel. I will establish your borders from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and from the desert to the Euphrates rivers. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the Jewish people never really, you know, took up all that territory. They pretty much just stuck within the boundaries of what is modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. So when people are advocating for the land of Israel being the ancestral homeland of the Jews, they're not, you know, seriously going, hey, well, they should have all that territory that was promised to them in the Bible. They're not advocating that they take over, you know, basically the entire Middle East. Now what you're looking at is a map of the 12 tribes of Israel and where that land was set aside for them. And then you can see the surrounding tribes that surrounded them, the Ammonites, the Moabites, I think you had the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Philistines right there. We're going to get to them in a little bit. So that's just an idea of the territory that they had when the Jews lived in the promised land. This is another map showing you the land that they possessed, and shows you the Edomites. Some of the maps will show you where the Nabateans lived. The Nabateans pretty much were the people responsible for that area, Petra. Amazing place. I've personally been there and slept a few nights there in the caves with the Bedouin, just enjoying that whole territory. So yeah, this just gives you an idea, another reiteration of what that land looked like. And obviously, due to time constraints, I don't have time to give you the entire breakdown of the history of Israel. So I'm just going to kind of start off with King David around 1,000 years BC, and then you have the first temple being built, Solomon's temple, around 950 BC. And about 150 years after that, around 700 BC, was the Assyrian invasion of the land of Israel. The Assyrians are people that lived what would be kind of like northern Babylonia, northern Iraq, northern Mesopotamia. And what was the significant part of that empire that came in and just swooped down and basically took 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel is that was the first diaspora of Jews that were just taken away into captivity and spread all over. And a lot of people say, oh, these are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, but there's not really this lost 10 tribes. There's always been a remnant of the 12 tribes living in Israel. Another interesting facet of this Assyrian empire when they invaded the land of Israel is this verse from the book of Isaiah, which is at the same time here as this empire. It says, I will raise up Cyrus in my righteousness. I will make all his ways straight. He will rebuild my city and set my exiles free, but not for a price or reward, says the Lord Almighty. So here Isaiah the prophet is telling you that the city, Jerusalem, is going to be rebuilt. The city is fine. The temple hasn't been destroyed. And so how is it that they're naming somebody by name who's going to send the people back, the Jews back into Jerusalem to rebuild the city? So we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So the Assyrian Empire is defeated by the Babylonian Empire. These are modern day Iraq. And they went in to Israel, and this time they destroyed the city. They destroyed the temple. You can see in this illustration this horrific event, what it must have been like, with the people just being thrown off the over the retaining wall, and the temple being destroyed and all the artifacts being stolen away. Well, the good news for the Jews is that Babylonian Empire was toppled by the Persian Empire. These are the Iranians, modern day Iranians. And the Persian Empire had a king earlier named in the book of Isaiah, named Cyrus the Great. And he had mercy on the Jews. And he told the Jews, you know what? You are free to go. As a matter of fact, here's some money. Here's some free passage back to your land. Go rebuild your city and rebuild the temple. So it's pretty fascinating that a prophecy from 700 BC about an event that the temple was destroyed in 587 BC, and then another guy would come along in 539 BC and say, you know what, here you go back and rebuild. So here's a beautiful illustration of what that second temple looked like. It was called later on Herod's temple, because Herod had rebuilt it after it fell into disrepair. To this day, Cyrus is revered by the Jews as this righteous Gentile who had found favor upon them. And I don't know if you've seen recently, but this comparison, side-by-side comparison between Cyrus the Great and Donald Trump. They're comparing Donald Trump to Cyrus because Donald Trump has so much favor upon the Jews and the land of Israel, a man who understands actual history and differentiates it from propaganda. So Donald Trump is the one who was one of the presidents, a long line of presidents, who promised that he would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And every other president from Bush to Obama got in there and broke that promise. But Donald Trump kept his promise. And not only that, he went on to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which was originally given to them, a mandate. And that's land that was stolen and then recaptured by Israel in 1967. And so Trump is like, yeah, it's your territory. They say to the victor go the spoils, but this is legally theirs. It's a legally binding land that belongs to them, that was stolen from them, that they repatriated back into their fold. So Netanyahu actually named I think it's just like a future settlement in the Golan Heights after Donald Trump. And there's actually coins being minted in Jerusalem, shekels being minted, and souvenir coins. I actually bought a few from eBay that have Trump and Cyrus on the same coin. So yeah, Donald Trump and Netanyahu, they're tight. Netanyahu understands that Trump gets it. And Netanyahu even got that famous ghetto shake from Trump, like we're bros, I feel your pain, you feel my pain. We're just Christians and Jews are both massively oppressed. The Christians, let's just say the white male born again Christian in America is the lowest hanging fruit in society. If you want to make fun of somebody, if you want to mock somebody, if you don't want any repercussions to come up against you, just go after the born again Christians, what they call the fundamentalists. That split between the fundamentalist Christians and the modernist Christians. So the only other person I know who got that kind of tight ghetto shake from Donald Trump is, yours truly. And that's why, him and I are both kind of laughing about that whole situation, because I told him, you know what, bro? We're going to look like old buddies, So let's fast forward to 332 BC when Alexander the Great was going around conquering the world, and he got to Jerusalem. What happened when he got there was absolutely fascinating. The rabbis came out and they greeted him, and they said, something, you understand that you're the fulfillment of prophecy. Of course, Alexander's like, what? And they talked about this prophecy in the book of Daniel, You might be familiar with that dream by Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, where it has a statue and it's got this guy with a head of gold, which represented the Babylonian Empire, and you had the breastplate of silver, which represented the Persian Empire. And so they were waiting for this empire, and that was the Greek Empire. So when Alexander the Great came in from Macedonia, that's when they opened up this prophecy, and they said, "You are this third." And I do believe it also says that would be split into four. And then you had the Roman Empire, which was split into two. That's why you have the two legs. And then it would all be dissipated down towards what we have today, basically. So you have this Greek Empire split into four, which was prophesied about. So you had the four generals that were taking divided up the territory that Alexander the Great had conquered. And the guy who took over the territory that encompassed Israel was a man named Antiochus, the Seleucids. And he did what was deemed as the abomination of desolation, where he set up a pig on the altar and did sacrifices of pigs on the altar. And he was extremely ruthless towards the Jews, and that ultimately led to the Maccabean revolt, which I do believe was started by his father. I'm doing all this from memory. I don't have any notes in front of me. The Maccabean revolt, which is if you ever read the book of Maccabees, or if you haven't, I highly recommend you read it. It's a super fascinating read. And they revolted against that Greek Empire, and they were victorious. And so that led to a period of autonomy until 63 BC, when Pompey, the Roman guy, came in and had a siege against Israel and conquered Israel, and the Romans became the empire, the occupying empire over the Jews in Israel. So let me just show you. Now this is 63 BC, so this is right there leading up to the time of Christ. So I'm going to show you a picture of what Jerusalem looked like at the time of Christ. And as you can see by this illustration, that it looks really like a fascinating place to visit. And I have personally walked the streets of Jerusalem, and I've walked the old city, the same streets, the Via della Rosa. I've prayed on the Western Wall, which I actually call the Wailing Wall, because I kind of cried like a baby when I was there. But Jesus was there, and he came to fulfill all these prophecies that were written in Isaiah and Daniel and Micah and the Psalms. But he was rejected. And he stood there in front of the temple, and he pointed to the temple, and he says, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be torn down." And they're like, "Wait a second. They don't tell me we're going to lose our second temple. I mean, seriously." But they really wouldn't listen to him, and they convinced the religious leaders, convinced the occupying military, the Romans. I call them the Italians. It's always the Italians, man. The Italians get off easy by always being referred to as the Romans. I know Italy wasn't technically a nation yet, but it's the same people, please. So he was crucified, which basically fulfilled prophecy at the same time. And if you think about all the prophecies Jesus fulfilled that are still in the Old Covenant, what is called the Old Testament, it's just unbelievable. And I got a little list here. If you want to push pause, you can look at any single one of these prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus. And this is just a small sample size. And you go back into the Jewish Torah. Forget about the reading all the rabbinical interpretations of these prophecies. These interpretations that have so many different meanings you can give, rather than just going to the actual text and looking at the actual text and then deciding for yourself if Yeshua fulfilled these, and could he have been the Mashiach. And I guess I can kind of understand how they wouldn't really understand how this guy could have been the Messiah, because the Messiah was supposed to be a king, and here you have these Roman occupiers, and he's not overthrowing them. And of course the rabbis are interpreting some of these scriptures that are actually supposed to be attributed to his second coming, but they're attributing them to his first coming, and they don't really understand the full picture. But the Bible says this was going to happen, that the prophet would be rejected in his own home. So of course, after Jesus was crucified, these people were like, see, he could not have been the Messiah. And because a lot of people listened to the rabbis who told them this was not the Messiah, these people decided to take matters into their own hands, and thus started the first Jewish revolt, where a bunch of patriotic Jews just rose up and says, you know what, we're going to overthrow these Romans. And they did. And so so the Rome had to regroup, go back to Rome and put together a military large enough to come back and recapture Jerusalem, part of their Roman Empire. And so they got this guy Titus, this military commander Titus, and he came to do this siege of Jerusalem. And it was a brutal siege, and they ended up coming in and they just ruthlessly murdered all these people. They tore down the second temple, which was prophesied by Jesus, and they banned. I think they burned at that time a whole bunch of the Torahs. Not only that, they burned priceless copies of the Talmud that were handwritten, Babylonian Talmuds. Just like what they did in front of the Notre Dame Church in France, many hundreds of years. They brought in, thousands of documents, handwritten documents, in carts, and they put them in front of that Notre Dame Church, all this Jewish handwritten scripture, and just burned, which was kind of ironic. When that church burned, I was literally thinking about all the Old Testaments that were burned by I'm not laughing about the church burning, but just the fact that it was just kind of ironic that happened. So anyhow, Titus did Rome was so happy with Titus that they put a arch, it's called the Arch of Titus, in Rome to celebrate his massacre of the Jews. And there's a very famous panel on that arch that depicts the Romans carrying away all the Jewish artifacts that were stolen from the temple, all that gold, all the menorahs and the cups and all the whatever the utensils they used, and they just basically pillaged the entire nation. And those stones that were toppled from the second temple, I mean, those were hewn. They perfectly fit together. I don't know how far away the quarry was for those stones, but the Romans knew that a good stone is a good stone. So somehow you got to give these people credit, the ingenuity and the ability to take all those stones from the second temple, most of them, and bring them back into Rome. And they used a bunch of those stones to build the Colosseum. And of course, we know the Colosseum is where they would feed Christians to the lions. So these Italians, man, they just completely destroyed Jerusalem. Then they would feed Christians to the lions, and ultimately they would just hijack their religion. My opinion led Europe into the Dark Ages by keeping people in the dark, by not allowing them to even have to read scripture in their own vernacular. And of course, we know about the Gutenberg printing press. When that was printed, I think it was like 100 years before the papacy even allowed the Jews to get a copy of the Old Testament in their language, but they would not allow the Christians to have a copy of the Bible in English. And in fact, if you were caught with a copy of the Bible in English, they would burn you to death. If you dared say, contradicted some of what the Roman church was teaching the people, and you would point to the scripture and say, no, that's not what they taught, you were burned at the stake. It was just ruthless to be a Jew or a born-again Christian back in those days. Of course, I know there are a lot of born-again Christians within the Catholic Church. And the irony for me is my step-grandmother, I followed her genealogical line, and then went all the way back up to what would have been her 14th great-great-grandfather, and his name was John Spicer, and he was burned at the stake in 1566 for using the Bible to contradict what was being taught by the Catholic Church. Okay, sorry about that rabbit trail. All right, where am I going to go? So going back to the siege of by Titus of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, we're going to fast forward now to 132 AD. So we're like 60 years after the destruction of the temple. Bar Kokhba rose up, and then Bar Kokhba came along and said, we're going to revolt against the Roman Empire again. And that's when Hadrian, this gay Roman general who later went on to become emperor, had another ruthless quelling of this attack, where he just murdered, captured, or imprisoned upwards of 1 million people, and that led to another diaspora of Jews scattered throughout the whole world. So Israel has never been the same since this genocide against the Jews by the Italians. But that brings me, before I go through this history some more, this promise that the nation will be rebuilt. Let's just backtrack around 600 years to the time of the prophet Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 36, verse 8 to 12, this is what it says. But you, mountains of Israel, will produce branches and fruit for my people Israel, for they will soon come. I am concerned for you, and will look on you with favor. You will be plowed and sown, and I will cause many people to live on you. Yes, all of Israel. The towns will be inhabited, and the ruins rebuilt. I will increase the number of people and animals living on you, and they will be fruitful and become numerous. I will settle people on you as in the past, and will make you prosper more than before. Then you will know that I am the Lord. I will cause people, my people Israel, to live on you. They will possess you, and you will be their inheritance, and you will never again deprive them of their children. So the Lord is talking about the land of Israel and the people of Israel, how they will come back and be reborn again as a nation, which of course we all know happened in 1948. All right, so let's plow through some historical events. We'll fast forward to the year 570 AD to 632 AD. 600 years after Jesus, Mohammed was born. Mohammed was born, Mohammed died. Mohammed never visited Israel. So while he was still alive, there was an Iranian invasion into Israel that fought against the Byzantines. That was in 614 AD. So now, fast forward a few years, Muhammad dies, 632. Then at 637, right, just 5 years after the death of Muhammad, in 637, the Muslims went in and stole Israel for themselves. Fast forward to the year 691, they built the Dome of the Rock on top of the holiest site of Judaism, the Temple Mount. Now you got to understand, there are still Jews living there. There has always been a remnant of Jews living in the land of Israel, but they don't have a military. They're mostly Orthodox Jews trying to follow Scripture, and here comes a bunch of guys that are spreading their religion via the sword, and there's nothing they can do. So that's 691. Now, fast forward a few hundred years to Pope Urban, who set up the council. What was it? The Council of Clement? Is it Urban or Urban? Anyhow, he pulled together all the religious leaders from the Roman Empire and said, look, these Muslims, they were called Mohammedans back then, have taken over the Holy Land. We need to take it back. And this led to the First Crusade. The First Crusade was 1099, when the Crusaders went in and they were victorious over the Mohammedans, and they retook Israel back from Islam. And we know there were 4 crusades, and not all of them were pretty, but we're just going to go to the year 1187. Ironically enough, July 4th, 1187, Saladin was victorious over the Crusaders and thus regained Israel back for the Mohammedans. That was the Battle of Hattin, or the Battle of the Horns, or Battle of the Little Horn. I can't remember exactly. So that was 1187. Now if you go forward a few years to the year 1307, this is the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm not going to go through all the different maps of that empire throughout that long history. But that empire reigned from 1307 to 1914, and the Ottomans sided. They were on the losing side in World War I. If they would have just stayed neutral, things would have been totally different. But they were on the wrong side of World War I, so what they say, to the victor go the spoils. that their empire got divided. But anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let's go to the middle of the Ottoman Empire to like the 15th and 16th century, the Spanish Inquisition. I may have touched a little bit upon this, but this is when these papal decrees went out to persecute people who were not Catholics. So they tortured Christians and Jews and Muslims and anybody who used to be a Catholic but converted to a different religion. And it was completely horrendous. I think Benjamin Netanyahu's father wrote an extensive book about the Spanish Inquisition, and I bought it. I bought a first edition copy, and when I got it, it was so thick and the words were so small that I never read it. I said, this is written for academia, and I ended up just selling it again on eBay. But anyhow, if you want to do some research on what it was like during that Spanish Inquisition, it was really bad, man, really, really bad. And then, from 1772 to 1815, that was when you had the Russian pogroms in Russia, where they had taken over other territory where they hadn't really had before, and they weren't used to all these Jewish people, and they just reacted so violently and negatively towards them that they drove a lot of Jews back into Palestine. This is kind of when a lot of Jews, during all this era, these pogroms against the Jews were not just limited to Spain and to Russia. I mean, in Germany and France and England, all throughout Europe. In fact, in World War II, when Hitler started going after these Jews, he had no trouble rounding them up, because a lot of these nations that Germany had conquered had no problem pointing out where the Jews were. So during those times where people just couldn't stand the Jews, they were telling them, go back to Palestine, go back to your home, we don't want you here. And if you look at the British census, going back, let's say, to 1864, 80% of Jerusalem was Jewish. When Mark Twain went there, I think I'm getting ahead of myself again. I'll save Mark Twain for later. So Palestine basically was this backwater malaria swamp. And the people, like even the Ottomans, they would rule out of Damascus. They didn't want to have anything to do with Jerusalem. So basically you had the religious Jews living in Jerusalem, and these nomadic Bedouins, people that surrounded the territory of Palestine, they were already landowners. And if you look at East Jerusalem, here I'll show you a picture, you can see that it's barren. It's, this is where all the surrounding countries are telling the Jews, go back to Palestine. Nobody wants you. Go back. Go back to that barren wasteland and live in the desert. Around this time, 1899 was a very famous incident called the Dreyfus Affair, where this Jewish officer in the French military was accused of being a spy. He was falsely accused, and the trial took a long time, and a lot of ink was spilt written about this guy, and in fact they started writing about Jews in general, and it whipped up this massive anti-Semitism through the whole nation of France. It kind of reminds me of the media in America now whipping up this frenzy of anti-white frenzy, trying to get the blacks to just go out and randomly just start attacking whites and accusing whites everywhere of being a racist. This is what happened during the Dreyfus Affair. And Theodor Herzl, very famous, they call him the father of modern day Zionism, which is basically the desire to create a homeland for the Jews in their ancestral home. That's all it is, the land of Zion. He saw this, and that's why he really started pushing this Zionist movement. So at the same time, Theodor Herzl is putting together these Zionist conferences, discussing, let's put our heads together instead of we're all like pulling in different directions. A guy who lived at the same time, Yusuf Daya al-Khalidi, he was the Arab mayor of Jerusalem, and they were asking him, whose land is this? And he said, who can challenge the rights of the Jews in Palestine? Good Lord, historically, it's really their country, right? That's what he's saying. If you dig underneath any so-called Palestinian village, you're going to find ancient Jewish artifacts. And whenever the Israeli Arabs are doing construction and their bulldozers find ancient artifacts, they don't turn them over to antiquities. They bury them in the dump because they don't want people to know. They're trying to rewrite history. So now we're going to enter the 20th century, and the clock's going to start ticking super fast. Time is just going to be packed into this century. It's going to start off with this Bosnian guy named Gavrilo Princip, and this guy is the guy he's the one who shot the Archduke Ferdinand that started World War I, along with his cohort Mohammed Besik. These Bosnian, Serb Bosnian Muslim guys who killed the Archduke of Ferdinand and started World War I. So we know that the Ottoman Empire, they were on the wrong side of that war. So that empire was going to be divided up. And here's a map of what the Middle East looked like pre-World War I and post-World War I. And here's a map of what Europe looked like pre-World War I and post-World War I. And I can't help but think about all the demonic reaction to the Jews living in that tiny sliver of land when all of these maps and lines were redrawn and have been that way for over 100 years, but it's that one tiny little state of a Jewish state. That's what they like to call it, a Jewish state. I don't know how many, like 50-something Muslim states, but for some reason the world can't handle one Jewish state. So in 1917, the British take over Israel as they're kind of like the governing force. General Allenby, he comes in. He was on a horse. They're like, why don't you ride into Jerusalem on your horse? He's like, ha. Jesus came in on a donkey. You think I'm going to ride into Jerusalem on a horse? He walked in. So the guy had a lot of respect. But how England was able to be, one of the reasons they were able to be on the victorious side of World War I is there was a man named Chaim Weizmann, okay, very famous Zionist Jew, and he was a scientist, and he helped England make acetone, which is a key ingredient in I forget what there's in their bullets or bombs or something, I don't know. So without Chaim Weizmann, Chaim Weizmann, they wouldn't be able to do what they did. As a matter of fact, one thing I did when I went to Israel that was on my bucket list, and I went there, Theodor Herzl, I went to his grave, and it was a touching moment, because without him, without Chaim Weizmann, Israel may not have come. I mean, it would have come, it's written in the Bible, but these guys really were instrumental. God used them. So anyhow, Lord Balfour knew what Chaim Weizmann had done for England to help them win World War I, and he said, what is it you want? Can I compensate you? And he says, I just want a homeland for our people. We're being persecuted everywhere we go. We just want to go back to our ancestral homeland and be recognized as a nation of Israel. So that led to the Balfour Declaration. Let me just read that declaration for you. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. This Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which any prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status employed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration of knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Of course, we know that despite all their fancy way of speaking and all their proper mannerisms, England never really does keep a promise. They will break that promise time and time again, which you're gonna see. So we know now Britain is the security and kind of quasi-government force in Palestine. And you can see that they couldn't even let the Arabs go anywhere without searching them for weapons, because there's no nation. This is not 1948. This is the 19 teens, and they're slaughtering Jews left and right. So we fast forward now to 1920, the San Remo conference, and this is the 100-year anniversary in Italy of this conference of people that got together, and they're trying to figure out a map for the Jews, and they came up with this map that shows the land of Israel. This is a proposed land of Israel, and you got to remember the whole Middle East has already been redrawn, and this is the territory that is set up for the Jews, and you can see that it encompasses what is now modern day Jordan, and refugees slowly started coming in to Israel, moving there to get away from all the anti-Semitism. But in 1922, they changed that map. They split more than half of that country away and left Israel just a sliver. And of course, this is also being shared with Muslims at that time. And in the 1920s, there began a series of murderous pogroms in Israel against the Jews, the most famous one being the 1929 massacre in Hebron, and 1929 in Safed massacre in Jerusalem, and Christians were being killed, land was being stolen, and at the same, Amin al-Husseini, who later became, a really good friend of Hitler, he was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem at that time, and he was overseeing this genocide against the Jews who were living there. So we're in that tumultuous period between World War I and World War II. But anyhow, the 1937 Peel Commission got together to discuss a way to figure out why this mandate isn't working and why there's so much unrest. And they came up with a new map. And this map would have given 75% of the land of Israel, I know they want to call it Palestine, whatever, to the Arabs, and just a tiny 25% to the Jews. And what do you think the Arabs said? No. No, because you know the mantra, from the river to the sea, Palestine it will be free. You hear it anywhere in the world. Yahud, from the river to the sea, Palestine it will be free. They want genocide from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. They want every single Jew wiped off that land. That's why they never agree to any of these proposals, two-state proposals, or ways for Jews and Muslims to live together in peace. They just won't do it. So that was 1937. Let me show you a picture here, 1938. Hopefully the file in this picture is large enough that I can show it, but it shows East Jerusalem and how barren it is, and how you can see that it's not this big, vast Palestinian village. And a matter of fact, it wasn't even really until the Jews started to go there and buying land. They never stole anything. Every piece of property was paid for. And once this happened, they started to redevelop the land, like was promised in the Bible. They will turn the desert, make the desert bloom, right? Then all of a sudden, all these refugees started coming. Immigrants from Jordan, from Egypt, from Iraq, from Lebanon, coming to Israel because they're like, hey, there's work there. There's work. Let's go make some money. So I've already mentioned Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the good buddy of Hitler. Here he is hanging out with Hitler, and here he is, rallying the Bosnian Muslim pro-Nazi troops. And the Grand Mufti went to Europe, and he I think he when he met Hitler, he came back, he got on the radio. He was in, I don't know if it was Egypt, but somewhere in the Middle East. He was on the radio trying to incite, this genocide against the Jews. And of course, about the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. And what happens when all those people are being persecuted? They're going to want to flee that persecution, and they're going to want to come to their ancestral homeland. So once again, the good guys win World War II, the bad guys lose, and the good guys decide to finally have a solution for these poor Jewish people that are being persecuted all over the world, and even persecuted in Israel. So they came up with another map, a two-state solution map for the Israelis and the Jews and the Muslims in Israel. And guess who rejected that plan? You guessed it, the Arab Muslims. This is a really important point, extremely important point. When you're laying the foundation of how we're going to get to 2020 and the annexation of the West, this is one of the key moments. This UN Partition Plan 181, Resolution 181, 1947, following Britain's announcement in February 1947 of its intention to terminate the Mandate government. This is like going to terminate the Mandate, and they're going to establish an actual state, right? The United Nations General Assembly appointed a special committee, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, to make recommendations on the land's future government. They recommended the establishment of two separate states, Jewish and Arab, because they know the Arabs cannot live in peace. They will want to slaughter the Jews. So let's just give them their own land and just have little separate borders, since somebody can't play in the sandbox nicely, right? To be joined by economic union with the Jerusalem-Bethlehem region as an enclave under international administration, right? So the General Assembly voted on the partition line, and it was adopted. It was adopted 33-13 with 10 absentees. The Jewish side accepted the UN plan for the establishment of two states, right? The Arabs rejected it, and instead they launched a war of annihilation against the Jewish state. I'm going to get to that invasion, trust me. But this is a very important map I want to show you. It shows you the British Mandate, where they cut that land of Palestine, Israel. That was going to be the Jewish. The Jews are the only ones who are accepting it. The Arabs are going to reject it. So the Jordanians are going to get that Transjordan. Transjordan means, on the other side of the Jordan River, and on the left-hand side is Palestine. And we know about how the map changed from the San Remo Conference, right? It's basically the same thing. It cut that home by more than half. So you guys know, if you're history buffs, May 14, 1948, Israel was declared a nation, and there was celebration of Jews dancing and singing that they finally have a place that they can have their own self-determination, their own government, their own laws, and they can worship in peace, theoretically. And that was the fulfillment of one of the key Bible prophecies that people had been waiting for 2,000 years. And let me read you that prophecy. Going back to the book of Isaiah, chapter 66, verse 8. Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen such things like this? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. Yes, Israel was born in a day, reborn. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, they were immediately invaded, and another genocide was attempted against the Jews. 5 nations came against a brand new toddler in the cradle, and they couldn't wipe them out because God was on their side. But those 5 nations, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, with a bunch of British generals and British equipment, invaded, and they stole the West Bank. They occupied the West Bank, and they went all the way and stole the old city of Jerusalem. And that was one of the darkest days of the 20th century. You never hear about this in history on TV. This invasion of legally obtained property, the United Nations internationally agreed this is the boundary, this is the country. But what enabled the entire West Bank to be stolen was the fact that a bunch of anti-Semitic British officers joined ranks and brought a bunch of their military equipment and strategically placed it all over all over Israel for the day that they were going to attack. And the Jews were complaining to anybody who would listen, like, hey, wait a second. The British are getting ready to help the Arabs attack us. And do you think the international community did anything? Nope. So let me read this little paragraph here about the Arab League and how these British guys led the Arab League in their attack against Israel. The British guy who was the guy who basically enabled this to happen was called John Bagot Glubb. They called him Pasha Glubb. Pasha is just like a Turkish Ottoman word for a high-ranking official. And so just keep that guy's name in mind here. And I'm going to read about the Arab League a little bit right here. The army of King Abdullah of Transjordan went to war with Israel in the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1948-1949. The Arab Legion, later the Jordanian army, was a remarkable military unit. First, some 37 British officers and 25 British non-commissioned officers, NCOs, led the army. Second, the Legion was the most effective Arab army in 1948, in large measure because Britain, as Abdullah's ally, led, funded, trained, and equipped it. It was the only Arab army in 1948 that covered itself in glory, defeating Israel in 2 sets of battles in and around Jerusalem's Old City and at Latrun, interrupted by a ceasefire. Now you got to keep in mind, what kind of weapons do the Jews have? But they're up against a military, 5 nation states. This is unbelievable that Israel was able to win. Most British servicemen in the Legion were seconded from the British Army. Some had private contracts with Abdullah. Aha! Follow the money. These guys had contracts, financial obligations to go to war and wipe out the Jews. 3 were detached from colonial service, including the Arabic-speaking Supreme Commander of the Legion, former Army officer John Bagot Glubb. Glubb's deputy was Jordanian Major General Abd al-Qadir al-Jundi. Israel inflated the British personnel numbers to 350 to include British soldiers with Arab irregular units and in its supernumerary capacities with the Legion. I'm not sure if I totally understand that. Is it? I think maybe Israel's saying that a lot more British people joined this fight. Some having deserted British forces as they withdrew from Palestine in 1948. So a lot of British people were so anti-Semitic they went AWOL to go into Jordan to help fight because they were so upset under the British mandate. They were so upset that they had to give the Jews a land that they said no. We would rather go AWOL, treason, and fight against the internationally recognized land of Israel. Israel saw the hand of mercenary former Nazi soldiers and Arabic-speaking Englishmen behind the disorderly primitive Arab bands. In other words, Israel could have won against these primitive Jordanians. These people that walked across the desert from Iraq. And matter of fact, when Iraq, when they went back to Iraq, these Iraqi soldiers, after having not wiped out the Jews of Israel from the river to the sea, they started hanging Jews in Baghdad in a public square. So this is a reference to the irregular Arab troops that served alongside the Legion. And Jerusalem's Anglican bishop came upon British casualties in the city's Austrian hospice personnel who absconded from the Palestinian police, I presume, and joined Arab forces. British personnel numbers within the Legion fluctuated. London nominally withdrew those officially contracted on the 30th of May 1948, but British soldiers commanded throughout the war at divisional, brigade, and regimental and battalion levels as they led 3 of the 4 mechanized infantry regiments ready on the 15th of May 1948. That is unbelievable. That's what I tell you before. Never trust the British. They may talk with this beautiful accent, but they will stab your back. So, here's a map of the land that was stolen. And you can see, does it say it on this map? Well, I'm looking at a different map. I'm going to have to pull up a map that shows Jordan. How Jordan is no longer called Transjordan. They changed their name from Transjordan because they say, we are no longer on just one side of the river. Now we are going to be on both sides of the river. And so they renamed that whole West Bank the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And that land of Samaria and Judea was stolen. And the most unbelievable thing to me is how Wikipedia has worded this invasion. They call it the Jordanian annexation of the West Bank. So there's no international outcry over the Jordanian annexation of the West Bank, but we're about to have a Jewish annexation, an Israeli annexation of the West Bank, and there's going to be an international uproar. Let's just fast forward real quick to Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian Authority, in an interview not long ago, admitted that the Arabs made a mistake by rejecting the United Nations 1947 proposal that would have created a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Now here's an image of a DVD that was produced called The Forgotten Refugees. After World War II, and after the Arabs were unable to wipe Israel clean of the Jews from the river to the sea, all those nations went back to their homelands. And in their homelands, 1 million Jews had been living in North Africa and the Middle East, okay? And they took out their frustration on innocent civilians. Since they couldn't militarily defeat a baby Jewish nation, they started murdering Jews in the streets of all those nations. And they started telling them, those that didn't murder, they said, you're gone. We're seizing all your property. Get out. And I think now there's maybe, I forget off the top of my head, like 5,000 Jews remaining in all of North Africa and any of the Arab nations. There was 1 million back in 1948. And those people became refugees, and many of them came to Israel. So when all the international community starts crying about the right of return of refugees, nobody is talking about these refugees that were booted from the places that they have lived for many, many, many generations. So they failed, the Arabs failed in 1948 to wipe out Israel. 1967, they surrounded Israel. And they were screaming every day on the radio, we are about to invade, we are going to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. And in just a moment, the Israelis sent all their airplanes out, flying under the radar. They knew when the shift change was in Egypt for the pilots on the military bases. They had all the intelligence, and in 6 days completely wiped out those armies. And they regained a lot of the territory that they lost in 1948. And when you see people crying now, we want to at least have the boundaries go back to the 1948 boundaries, right? No, it's not happening. You stole the land by trying to wipe out a baby Israel. In 1967, you tried to finish that job. You lost, and now you lost some of that land. And even later on, Israel went back and gave back some of that land. The whole Sinai Peninsula, they could have kept that land. They turned it back over. You had that famous conference in Khartoum, Sudan, where Israel offered to give back like almost all of that land for peace, just for peace. And what did the Arabs say? The 3 no's, the famous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. tells you all you need to know. There's so much happening in this century that I just gonna have to skip over a lot of it. You know, the Yom Kippur War, right? 1973. Yom Kippur. It's a holy day in Israel, and they got invaded on their holiest day. I mean, that's like whatever, attacking Poland at Christmas time. You know, they're all going to be celebrating Christmas. From 1987 to 1993, I do believe I have those years correct, was the first Intifada, where no Jew was safe, no civilian Jew was safe. People were being murdered at clubs, restaurants, buses, just slaughtered. Anywhere they could find a Jew that was vulnerable, they would slaughter them. Now, if you fast forward to the negotiations at the Oslo Accords, where Israel offered land for peace. That's all. Land for peace. Nope. The Arabs continually broke the rules of that accord. Then you had Camp David with Bill Clinton and Yasser Arafat. The true story of Camp David was that for the first time in the history of the conflict, an American president put on the table a proposal based on UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338, very close to the Palestinian demands, and Arafat refused even to accept it as a basis for negotiations, walked out of the room, and deliberately turned to terrorism. And that started the second Intifada. So what would you do if you are in charge of keeping your citizens safe? You got to do something. And that's why they built this physical barrier between the Palestinian territories and the Jewish territories. And the Palestinians that came in to the Israeli territories to work, they had to be screened for weapons. Now let's fast forward to the year 2008 and the famous Olmert offer, where Olmert offered to withdraw from, I've heard, anywhere between 91 and 95% of the West Bank. Imagine that. Okay, Palestinians, we have a proposal for you so we can live in peace. How about we just withdraw everybody from the West Bank in exchange, for us being friends? What was the answer? You guessed it. No. Here's a little illustration of the times that Israel offered land for peace. 1967, Israel offers 100% of the West Bank to Jordan, of the Sinai and Gaza to Egypt, and the Golan Heights to Syria. That was rejected. 1982, Israel gave up 100% of Sinai to Egypt for peace. 1993, Israel gives up land to the Palestinian Authority. In 94, land to Jordan. In 2005, 100% of Gaza. And they left behind like millions and millions of dollars worth of equipment, that greenhouses that could have sustained that entire Gaza economy, and they just tore it down and ransacked it. In 2008, Israel offers 95% of the West Bank to the Palestinians. Every time, the answer is no, no, no. So hopefully by now, you understand the demonic hatred that is surrounding the Israelis, the Jewish Israelis, from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which is their wing of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. You have Hamas, which has completely taken over Gaza, and then you have, of course, that's the Revolutionary Guard that is the pulling the puppet strings. And the Hezbollah, man, that's like one of the most radical terror organization in the world because of their nation-state funding bill. And then, of course, you have the PLO, the Palestinians, that are being brainwashed from the age of little children to grow up to want to annihilate the Jews. And something else to think about that you're not really being taught in the media or in schools or in history is where the name Palestine came from. If you go back in history to a guy we already discussed, Hadrian, Roman emperor. He became an emperor. He was in charge of that area in Israel and Syria during the Bar Kokhba revolt, and he was so pissed off he changed the name to Palestine. I don't know if I've already discussed this in this, but I'll just run through it real quick. Of course, so the Philistines, which is where the name Palestine comes from, are people that are not even Arab. They have Greek DNA because they're from the Aegean Sea. They're an Aegean people. They were called by the locals Sea People when they came and landed in Gaza, and they were the historic arch enemy of the Jews. One of the historical arch enemies. In fact, they had stole the Ark of the Covenant one time, and it was so bad for them that they gave the thing back. They're like, we don't want this. But the Philistines have been extinct since probably the 4th century before Christ. And they had either just left, died away. A lot of them were wiped out by Samson. They assimilated into culture. There was no Philistine state, Palestinian state. There was no Philistine currency, bank, none of that stuff. They were just, boat people that came in. And so that's how Palestine got the name, because after that Bar Kokhba revolt, this guy, Hadrian, was so mad that he said, you know what, we're changing the name of this country to Palestine. They always like Philistia, Syria. I don't forget the exact word, but it means Palestine. It means from the Philistines. And the Jews were like, what are you talking about? We're not Philistines. That's our arch enemy. They're extinct. Yeah, that's why we're going to mock you, and we're going to name your nation Palestine. And so for centuries, the Jews were called Palestinians. The Jews had their own currency that had, Palestine on it. It wasn't the Arabs. The Arabs just sort of adopted that as if it's their own ethnic culture. You got to remember the pagans that lived around the Jews at the time, the Nabateans, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites. These are all kind of what morphed into, they're the descendants, the Arabs today, they're the descendants of these people, what's left of them, and they just one day just decided to call themselves Palestinians, as if it's their own ethnicity. You have to be woefully ignorant to really not understand that if you honestly take a look, at history. So you've got this security barrier trying to protect yourselves, but you are surrounded by people who will do anything to kill you. They will break into a settlement that doesn't have the same security as like the IDF surrounding it, and they will slaughter families in the middle of the night, teenagers, children. These images are just heartbreaking when you look at the victims of the Jewish victims, innocent civilians, of these people that are just going in with knives, stabbing you in your sleep, and driving their cars, plowing their cars into you, blowing up buildings. And it comes to a point where you're looking back in history at all the times they have said no to peace. 1937, the Peel Commission, no. 1947, the UN partition, no. 1967, Khartoum, no. Camp David, the year 2000. Taba, which is probably as close as they ever came, 2001, probably the most honest negotiations to date, no. 2008, Omar offered no. 2012 till now, no. So what do you do? You go on Wikipedia, you look at history, you know that Jordan, with the help of the anti-Semitic British officers, annexed the West Bank. So now we have a new president of the United States who's not all talk. He's more action than talk. And he sent over Jared Kushner. Remember that name, Jared Kushner. Donald Trump went over there, prayed at the Wailing Wall. Ghetto shake with Benjamin Netanyahu. So what can we do? And they had been working diligently for years to come up with a peace plan. Part of that peace plan, they offered the Palestinians $50 billion. And they offered to help create 1 million jobs to elevate their status in society, in the global economic sphere. And they said no. They offered another $1 billion just to help with tourism, that's residual income. They said no. So Israel's like, okay, you know what? We're gonna give you the best what we can have. We're gonna annex the West Bank, and we're gonna give you, your autonomous areas, and we're gonna give you connections between your peoples. You're gonna have your own autonomy, and that's what's happening in 2020. Benjamin Netanyahu and Jared Kushner and the ambassadors from both nations and all these experts are over there painstakingly going step by step on the best boundary so Israel could come in and secure a peaceful West Bank area and have Jews living in peace and Arabs living in peace. And I don't see why the world is going to freak out over this, because right now international forces are funding to have Palestinian settlements built all over the West Bank. Nobody's talking about that. They're just talking about the few Jewish settlements that are being built. But what's happening, and even like Barack Obama, he just dumped them $250 million on his way out the door. Here you go build some more settlements in the West Bank. Where there's an Israeli settlement where Jews are creating their own community, they wake up one morning and they look over on the hill next to them, and there's a bulldozer, and they're like, who's that? It's money from these international troublemakers who are now trying to build a Palestinian village right next to a Jewish settlement. They're trying to create a problem where there's not one. And this has been going on, like heavy going on. And I was over there. They got signs up that you can't even enter certain territories as a Jew because you will be killed. So Netanyahu has no choice, because his current government is only for, I think, one more year. Then it's going to be turned over to Benny Gantz. You could forget about it. So this is the only time right now in the imminent future where Israel finally has a chance to regain security over their own sovereign territory. Who are you to tell us what to do, what to build, and where to go on our own territory? I never really understood how the international community and United States presidents and United States senators can call the Jews occupiers, accuse them of being an apartheid state, and tell them what and where they can build their own property on their own land. It makes no sense to me. And so I hope this gives you a better understanding of what is happening in 2020 and how it led to this, and take that into consideration when the news comes on and starts telling you what they think you should know rather than what you do know and what you feel in your gut. Okay, so sorry it went long. Hope it came out well. I don't normally do a documentary like this where I just find all the pictures that I'm going to use and then I just add my commentary afterwards without notes, Anyhow, until next time, stay well, stay safe, take care. Thanks. Bye.